Well, having lived nearly 70 years, I think having seen changes in society, I can see where we are distanced more. Like, things might be more virtual, or, people having lots of friends, but they've never actually met them. But I think I'd say when I'm talking about an aloneness, I think it probably just comes from our own individual histories and the places where people didn't quite understand us when we were little, and we kind of continue to get that initial connection that we needed. But also I think the way society is set up means that we have to be divided. We have, it is divide and rule the way that we live.
Welcome along to another Big Idea Show. Today I'm very excited to be joined by Leah Thorn. Leah, how's it going?
I'm very pleased to be here.
Good. So those of you who don't know Leah, she is a spoken word poet and activist. And we first met, didn't we, on the when we did the Quarter Foundation films. And those films are about a minute and a half. And it was very hard to... Well, it was not very nice for me to have to say, make it shorter, but I really want to hear all the great stuff you have to say, which is why I wanted to invite you on the show.
It's a lovely opportunity.
Good. And our topic for today is creativity for social change. Right. So before we kind of go into any more detail, I'm going to ask you can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Because I think that what you do perfectly frames the question, and then we can look at it in a bit more detail, really, from there.
Okay. So I did psychology at university, and I think the reason I did it was I wanted to understand what was wrong with me and my family. and it sort of prepared me for everything and nothing. One of the things it gave me was I think an understanding about inequality and about how social structures and political structures really impact individuals. And at that point, when I came out with a psychology degree, I didn't know what to do. And I ended up doing sex education and counselling for the Family Planning Association. And again, it gave me an idea of seeing the individual, but also not pathologizing individuals, actually seeing the struggles that they were up against. Certainly these young people, the young women in particular, and how they were being pressured into sex. And so I was beginning to think about how I could apply what I'd learned to a wider commitment to making change. And I think the turning point came when I was in my mid-20s and I got a job as an action researcher on the streets of Birmingham, working ostensibly with 13 to 16-year-old young women who'd been deemed at risk. And what the funders meant was at risk of pregnancy. But there were many ways these young women were at risk, and I realised that I couldn't really work with them if I didn't do the work myself to understand what it meant for me as a woman. And that's when I really got politicised and got very excited about women's issues. And for the next 20 odd years, I did feminist youth work and worked with young women in youth clubs and on the streets, and then ended up as an advisor on work with girls and young women at the Inner London Education Authority. And then in 1990, Margaret Thatcher decided that we were to be disbanded. So I was 40 and I had no idea what to do with my life because I'd built up this career. And it was like real meltdown time. And I went to see a friend of mine, Paminda Chadha, who was a performance poet, and had no idea what performance poetry was. And the minute she stood up and started to do her poetry, I just got really excited because it was really, she was talking about her life, she was talking about sexism and racism, and I thought, that's wonderful. You can just stand up, you have the microphone, and you get to say how things are for you. But then it's also where the personal becomes very universal. So the things she was saying were very specific to her, but really touched me. And then top of the bill was Liz Lockhead, who's just wonderful. And she really made me laugh and cry. And I thought, I want to do that. So I took my redundancy money and I went and did 3 months full-time acting course. And then I started going on writing courses. I had no idea. I've never written poetry. And I know I don't know if I should say this or not, but I'm not a crafted poet. You know, I couldn't really teach anyone to write a really good haiku or a sonnet. But poetry became another tool, really, to help people express themselves and to help me express myself.
Yeah.
So I was writing my own poetry. At the very beginning, I was writing poetry about being a survivor of the mental health system, because I was in a group called Survivors Poetry, and that seemed such a powerful way to talk about experiences that I'd felt I had to hide. And so, not, just coming out of feeling ashamed about my experiences and what happened to me, and was always very kind of women-centered. And I started to be asked if I wanted to do workshops with women in the mental health system. And I said yes immediately. And I realized that although I wasn't really teaching them how to write poetry, because I couldn't do that really, what I could do was set up the conditions so that we could talk to each other, and out of that came really lyrical, poetic pieces. And there's something about writing for performance rather than for the page, which means that your voice is really important, your actual speaking voice, how you speak, the language you use, the accent you have, the breath you take. And that really excited me. And so it went on from there, really. That's a sort of short answer of 40 odd years.
Wow, awesome. And I love that it's that idea, isn't it, of if you want to be able to help others, or if you want to cause change, you've got to cause the change internally.
Completely. You have to. I wouldn't ask anyone to do anything that I haven't been willing to do myself.
Yeah.
Which means just look at things that are really hard, both for yourself and in the world. Because I think that makes you more credible, and certainly as an artist, I wouldn't dream of asking somebody to do something that was out of bounds for me. Yeah,
definitely. And I think, do you find it means that you're able to relate, and therefore, like you said about doing the workshops, it's not necessarily about, knowing exactly what the proper format is, but it's being able to empathise and understand what they're trying to express, but maybe the challenge is because you understand that you can empathise, because that's something I totally feel, and that's what a lot of the stuff I do, and what this is about is being able to have the space to find your voice, because I always felt, I can't speak, so being able to offer that other people that opportunity. Is that something you'd agree with then, that I guess this is quite a big question, but to ask, when people say about what's my calling, what do I want to do in life, should it be that rather than maybe necessarily, you look outside and see what areas you can help in, but also going, what do I want to find for myself? Because then you truly know what and how people can be supported, because you support yourself first.
Yeah, I was thinking about an example of you, really, if I can refer to something that you said, was that you wanted to get more into poetry. And then you took the leap, and clearly what came with it, and kind of anxieties, and can I do this? And then you did it, and it was so inspirational. And it's that quality sometimes that all you need to do is to show someone else what's possible for you, and by virtue of that, for them. So that's a lot of what I do. And I think focusing on myself gets me a long way, but it's always ultimately going to be limited, because I'm an older woman, I'm a white woman, I'm upwardly mobile, working class, and how people see me will be a particular kind of person. So I can't just rely on my own experiences. I have to find ways of helping other people say what their experience is, and being able to listen and not make judgment and not try and correct or line it up with what I know. And that sometimes can be quite difficult, because we're just also coated with assumptions and oppressor material that sometimes we have no idea about. And it's not to blame any of us for that, but that is part of the work as well, is being able to see what your own limits are on your thinking, so that you're not just imposing your ideas on someone else. This would be a good idea if you did that. I mean, sometimes you have to do that when you facilitate a workshop, because if you give someone a blank piece of paper, sometimes it's really hard to make that first mark.
Yeah.
So I kind of give them an exercise, an activity as a sort of a scaffold to hold ideas, and then afterwards you can take the scaffold off and they can play with it more. But so I've got a whole repertoire of activities now that I can get people writing from. But ultimately, that's not what's most important. What's most important is creating an atmosphere in which we're willing to be vulnerable, in which we're willing to go, I don't know if I can do this, in which we're willing to go, oh, I don't know if this is any good, and really be open to being told what's good about it. You know, that's really the work as far as I can see it, and that's what but that's what brings about social change, individual and social change, is the conditions being right, so that you're not feeling under attack and you're not attacking someone else. And how do we do that in a world which is so predicated on criticism and, you know, competition?
Yeah. Okay, that's a big question.
Yeah.
So I think we'll take a break and we'll come back and
Okay.
we'll start off with that again.
Okay.
Welcome back. We're in part 2 of Creativity for Social Change with Leah Thorn. So we've already covered so much. Like, I think there was elements of like leadership, of kind of finding your why, of creativity. God, there's so much we could just keep chatting. But we said we're going to come back with this idea. It was really lovely how you said it's not necessarily about, you know, you have activities, but it's not about exactly what those activities are. It's creating the environment in which people... It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to try. And I really like how, you know, you said it starts with the individual, which I totally agree with. But how do we then, once we've addressed and looked at the individual, how do we then take this idea wider? How do we make a community kind of say it's okay to be vulnerable?
So when I was talking about setting the conditions, it is in a group setting. The only time that I really work one-to-one it was in prison. When I was a writer in residence, I could work one-to-one. But normally I'm working with groups, even if it's just 3 or 4.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting question, and I think what I'd say is there's something about the personal being political that really works. When one person starts to talk honestly, it's kind of a ripple effect, and that means that you start to see that things aren't just your individual problem. And certainly every workshop I do, that's the moment when it feels like, I don't really talk about magic, but there's like something happens when the first person actually does take the risk and says something. And it doesn't matter what the setting is, whether it's in a school, whether it's in a prison, whether it's in a mental health setting, whether it's here in Folkestone in the workshops I've done with older women. There's a moment of recognition that first and foremost, being human beings, we really crave cooperation, I believe. And I think we really want to know others, we want to cooperate, we're really curious, and I think it's really hard in a for-profit society to be able to stay true to that. So I think what I'm doing is you're kind of building bit by bit as they each hear each other. It becomes evident that there are wider forces, that it's not just about an individual hang-up. And then the other way that can be taken out into a wider audience is through performance. So, for example, in the prison, I always love the opportunity for people to read their work. I perform it or read it, because that is just such a valid way of publishing.
Yeah.
And it's a way of others being excited, and also just that sense when a poem actually lands, it's like this just wonderful thing happens. I know for me, I wrote and I write just because I have to. There's an impetus. But when someone's in front of you and you can see that they're nodding, or they're crying, or they come up afterwards and say, that really spoke to me, and they want to tell you what it means for them, you're in that then you're in connection, and it's the power of creativity, but it's also the power of reminding us who we are as human beings. And so I think all the time there are many things going on in the moment, and it's how creativity reminds us of ourselves. So, for example, one example might be in the Holocaust. When I go into prisons with the Anne Frank Trust, and Anne Frank's story is so powerful because ultimately she didn't know if anyone was ever going to read what she wrote. I think she always hoped they would. She always had an eye on that. But she was writing because she had to write. And then there's that moment where it goes out into the world, and it's separate from you, and it reaches others.
Yeah.
And I think I just don't underestimate what it actually does. And certainly working in prisons, I see it over and over again, that when you're in a space that is so ultimately dehumanizing, I mean, you have a number, you're told when to do everything, that your one point of liberation is in your mind and what you can do with your mind. And then to have that put out to others and to have it received is so validating. It's not just in prisons, but I just see it most starkly there.
Yeah.
Because it is so much. But people just forget who they are, especially if they're long-term in prison. It's really hard to hold on to who you are outside of being a prisoner.
Yeah. Do you find kind of when you're going in and doing it in prisons, is it kind of harder to kind of get them to tap into that creativity and that to kind of let go of the, like you said, the taking that step to be vulnerable, or is it easier because it's, like you said, the because it's so stark, they're dying to express themselves. Is it easier or harder? I couldn't.
Well, it's got its own kind of conditions, really. So what I'd say is a lot of people start writing poetry when they're in prison, because one thing you have quite a lot of is time, especially as they're locked up so much of the day now. So some people will reach for poetry even if they've never done it before, and it is tricky because at the moment, because I'm not working full time in a prison, I just do one-off day workshops, and prisons are very, how can I say it? Well, sometimes they're a bit disorganized, so they might have 15 people sign up for a workshop, and then on that morning, nobody might turn up. So sometimes I have people come who have no interest in poetry, certainly no interest in Anne Frank or genocide or thinking about dehumanization. So I might walk into a room with loads of people just sitting back in their chair, kind of going, oh God, another old white woman do-gooder. And then, but I love that. I love that challenge of being able to talk about why I'm there.
Yeah.
And then, so I don't know, it is some of my favorite work in terms of just the realness of the relationships, because you don't have long. I'm probably not going to see them again, and in that moment you have to just make that connection, and it's I think those things are really hard to do that, but there's something that I think is also the easiest thing, because I think we're hardwired as human beings to really have that ability to reach each other. And it often makes me think that my dad had really quite severe Alzheimer's, and towards the end of his life, I felt like I had to be 150% of myself to reach him. I had to just concentrate everything onto reaching him. Sometimes it was physical, which of course in the prison you're not supposed to be physical. Sometimes I will touch, just because I can't bear not to if someone clearly just needs to have an arm touched. But there was something about not just physically reaching for someone, but reaching for someone to communicate with all of you that I really want to know you, and I'm here. There's somebody here, because I think it doesn't matter if you're in prison or not. A lot of us go around as if there's no one there. Even if we're surrounded by friends, there's something, really early that means we feel alone. And I think poetry can smash through that aloneness. And certainly when you write poems and people respond to them, oh my God, that is the least alone I ever feel. That moment, when somebody recognizes it. I don't know if you felt that when you did your poem, but when you see somebody really listening and receiving what it is you're offering. And of course, sometimes you do a poem and there's nobody there receiving it. Really, like I used to do a lot of poetry gigs above pubs, and people had come really to drink. They weren't that interested in hearing poetry. So, yeah. But anyway, so I think I lost the thread of the question.
No, but I want to pick up on, but I think maybe we'll have to take I don't know how we're doing on time, we'll have to take another break and come back to it, because I think it's going to be a big question. But you said their loneliness, and that's a huge thing, and I don't know, I guess I'll ask you a pre-question, then we can go into it maybe, is around this idea of, do you think a lot of kind of social challenges, and this is speaking very broadly, comes down to loneliness, and technology is making us more disconnected, more lonely? I've had conversations with people where they've said it kind of often comes back to that. No one understands, no one gets me, or I'm scared to reach out. Is loneliness do you think that is kind of, because I guess with all the people may talk about different experiences, like you said, in their poems or whatever way they express themselves, but it does it come, I guess I'll ask you a question, does it come down to the similar core emotions that we and different things make us experience them in different ways? And is loneliness, does it seem to be quite a big one? Or increasingly so?
Well, having lived nearly 70 years, I think having seen changes in society, I can see where we are distanced more. Like, things might be more virtual, or people having lots of friends but they've never actually met them. But I think I'd say, when I'm talking about an aloneness, I think it probably just comes from our own individual histories and the places where people didn't quite understand us when we were little, and we kind of continue to get that initial connection that we needed. But also, I think the way society is set up means that we have to be divided. We have, it is divide and rule the way that we live. Whether you take any of the oppressions, any of the isms, or it's almost like we agree that we will be separated. And sometimes, not just through poetry, but through any form of creativity, I think it can just remind you of connection. But that's what I was saying about, it's not just about an individual experience that I'm interested in. Obviously, I am interested in individuals, but I'm also interested in how we blow things out of the water. And when we come back, maybe I can give an example of that.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
It's a good point. Take a break. We'll be back in a little bit. Thank you for staying with us. Leah Thorn is in the hot seat today, spoken word poet and activist. So we were going to come back, weren't we, and talk about how do we take it from the individual to the wider population and make it kind of bigger than ourselves. And you left us nicely, you kind of pulled together my all over the place questions, because they were just literally every time you said, I'm kind of thinking of all these different questions, you pulled it together nicely. To some examples of some of the stuff that you do, and maybe what else, other things listeners out there might be kind of able to think about doing.
Yeah, because I find I always understand things better if I have something practical, like an example. Yeah. So this is the example that I'd give. And it's about a prison, but it clearly is a much wider issue. So both men and women in prison hurt themselves, self-harm, but women do it with much more regularity and in much greater numbers than men do. And the prisons, certainly when I was writer in residence at the women's prison, it was a real issue. I mean, women were just hurting themselves left, right and centre, and it was obviously the care of the woman was important, but then it was also the prison officers had to do so much paperwork, and it was just really, and also it's distressing, to actually have to witness this and also to go through it for the women. And so you could just say, oh well, women who go into prison have a propensity to hurt themselves, that's why they're in prison, or they're really messed up, or you could say things like that. But what's much more important is to look at what is there about society that would make women hurt themselves in much greater numbers than men. And then you start to look at how men will often hit out and women will hurt ourselves.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's kind of we're born with that. It's how you're taught, that a woman would be much more harm to herself actually than to society. So you've got a prison with lots of women who are much more harmful to themselves than to society. And even if they weren't self-harming before, they might well start in prison because they just did not know what to do with the feelings.
Yeah.
It was so unbearable. So when I first went into the prison, they had a project called SHARP, which was a self-harm project, where they would take women who were prolifically self-harming and put them together, which is problematic in itself. But it was more of a therapeutic setting. And it didn't last very long, I have to say. The prison couldn't let it last very long because it was very money and time intensive. But it meant that I had a way of working with women who were self-harming. And I wanted them to understand, I wanted them to hear each other, that they could then understand that it wasn't just them.
Yeah.
And that's always part of a healing process. So I started to collect poetry by women, and also I asked them to write or to talk to me about where self-harm started, how it fits into their life. So out of it came this book, which is called Release, and it was actually designed, it's written by women in prison who self-harm, and it was designed for other women in prison.
Yeah.
So that when women would feel really desperate, they could reach for this book. We wanted to make it small enough so it could go underneath a pillow, all round edges, and we just wanted it to look very beautiful and be accessible. The work is really hard to read because women harm themselves for good reasons. They've been so hurt, and then end up turning it on themselves. So, and then what happened was, when I finished working in the prison, I got a grant and I sent this book to all the women's prisons in the UK. But the way of things, it was also lots of other people wanted to read it.
Yeah.
And so it meant that they were not only hearing about women in prison, but they were also thinking much wider about women and about what would make us do this to ourselves. And that's what I mean about how you take it out. And I've got a big challenge at the moment because I'm trying to think about how my work really affects social change, and if it really does, or if it does just put a sticky plaster on things. So I was delighted with my work in prison, and I felt that every day I could see that difference was, I was making a difference, not just me, but the poetry and what was happening. And then I went to the States on a Winston Churchill Travel Fellowship, and I was going around women's prisons in different states with theatre and drama companies. And for the first time, I heard people be very critical of artists in prison, that there was a whole argument that with the prison industrial complex, we should be bringing it down completely, not making it more acceptable. And so that probably was the start for me of thinking about, am I really making a difference? Is this really working for social change? And I think it is tricky, because it's a bit like with Older Women Rock. Individual women have been so impacted by the work we've been doing, and their lives have been changing. And obviously the way to get social change is one-to-one and building connections. But I think what's needed at the moment with the way the world's going is it needs something much faster. And so the question you're asking is one that I'm really beginning to ask myself big time, is how do you speed this up, and how do you really start to challenge the structures so that we live much more rationally? And and what's the role of artists within that? So that's a whole week discussion.
Definitely.
And it would be great to have that conversation with other artists who have this as their goal.
Definitely. Well, I guess it's like you said, it's that performance element, and we have the technology, and technology is spreading in a lot of negative ways. It all spreads negative news, fake news, all that kind of stuff. But it can also spread positive stuff and creativity, and like you said, the performance, and that. Like that really struck me what you said there about the performance to kind of give and to contribute and to give change, because I've always seen kind of performances, oh well, I don't want people to think it's just me standing up there wanting to kind of show off, but to use it to impact long term, that it is powerful. And can we, is it the role of, is it the mechanism, do you think, because like you said, is it writing, having those poems and having them spread, or is it more, is it that it needs to hit a tipping point in terms of the number of artists maybe doing it, that we no longer accept maybe the negative, and the positive becomes the more general consensus?
So what would I say to that? I think what I'm talking about is, I mean, you can send stuff out on the internet now, and like we made a film I worked with Claire Unsworth, this wonderful filmmaker in Folkestone, and we made a film in her dad's front room, and it's now been shown in Dubai, it's been shown across the States, it's been shown across Europe, and there's that sense that you can make something very local, and then if it hits a nerve, it goes out.
Yeah.
But I think what I'm thinking about, and I think that's important, but I think what I'm interested in is how do you discombobulate? How do we get so discombobulated that we refuse to keep going along with things?
Yeah.
And it's a bit like, say, the Me Too movement. It's like there was a point, and then everything tipped, and then the whole narrative changes, and people are having conversations. But there's also a danger there that things get appropriated, and you lose the kind of the real edginess of it, and suddenly it's been taken over by mainstream, and so it's no longer edgy and undermining of oppression and I don't like the word discombobulating. It's like, so, and I think creativity really has that power to do that. So I'm trying to think, I realise it might sound a bit confusing, but I'm trying to think about the individual and how the individual really finds their voice, figures out what they've never said and needs to be said, that the world needs to hear, and then find ways of doing it and bringing people together to do that. But also, how do we almost like, what's the equivalent of taking to the streets? Creatively, what does that mean? And so that's what I want to find out. That's what I want to do with Older Women Rock. That's the next stage, really, is to move us out of communing with each other and really taking it out and taking our issues out as older women and aligning with younger women and older men and just seeing what it is that we can do together. So it does sound a bit idealistic, but I really don't want to give up on idealism. I think it's fine, and I think naivety is really good. I think it gets you a long way.
Definitely. Well, it sets the tone, what you're saying about being vulnerable. I think sometimes we have big ideas and people go, how the hell are you going to do that? You're being vulnerable, which, like you said, is the first step to going, right, what's possible? Literally saying, we don't know how, but it is possible. I declare it's possible. And be a stand for it. Maybe
the other strand is to understand why we're scared of being vulnerable. And I think the mental health system and mental health oppression generally, like this whole notion of what's normal and what's wrong with somebody, I think that keeps all of us with our vulnerability under wraps, because for some of us, when we showed our vulnerability, what we got was the mental health system, and we didn't really want that. Nobody would ever choose that, but sometimes that's the only thing that's available. So I really understand why we kind of keep our vulnerability close to us. And there are times when I feel like, oh, blow it, and I'll just really say what's hard for me to say. And there'll be times when I'll think, maybe this isn't appropriate here. Because being vulnerable can be seen as a weakness. And that was the other answer to your question. In prison, it's always a balancing act, because so much of being in prison is you have to keep face. And that's true, maybe obviously more so in the men's prison, because they're really into keeping up, this hardness. But that can also be true in the women's prison, that you cannot afford to really just let down the shutters. And the first time a man speaks honestly and maybe cries in a group, it's like everything just changes. And men who've been very harsh and critical will often, you can just see things melting away because one man has really risked something. And I think we're all willing, I think we're just eager to risk it, but I think it's lots of reasons why we don't.
Yeah, finding those leaders, those ones that are prepared to take that first scary step to show others that it is okay and it's possible what's on the other side.
Yeah, and sometimes when you're facilitating a workshop, you have to be willing to set the tone. So I will often talk about my feelings about being in the prison. I'll talk about being in the mental health system, not the criminal justice system, because actually, although nowadays they're so close, the criminal justice system and the mental health system. And so sometimes just by putting yourself in the position of being the first one, if you do it in a way that doesn't demand people's sympathy or isn't making it all about you, but just as a way of saying, listen, let's just get down to it. This is how it is. Reconnecting as humans, whatever the experience, you all have the base. That's what I go in with.
And emotions.
And also that feelings, I think the expression of feelings is a lifesaver. I mean, that comes from, I do peer counselling and that's kind of the basis of it, but that in order to get unhurt, you need not to be throwing your feelings around all the time, but you need to have places where you can do that, just to stay on top of what is an extremely strange world. So.
Absolutely. So I'm sure people listening, we've opened these huge questions, and I'm sure there'll be people, I mean, you've already got me thinking, I'm kind of going, what can we do? What is possible? What is that one idea or those, those changes that can happen? How can people, if they've got kind of comments, want to get involved in what you do, are doing things that I think could kind of work in collaboration, how and where can people find you and get in touch?
Probably the best thing is to email me so it's Leah, Leah at leahthorn.com. Or just to Google me, it will come up with my website and the other work I'm doing, and that's got my contact details.
Absolutely. And are there any links or websites we can give for the various projects you mentioned?
Yes, so Older Women Rock has got one, and then my website's got a lot of the films and the prison work on it. Okay,
so it's leahthorn.com.
Yeah.
And olderwomenrock.com?
It's Love Older Women Rock at wordpress.com.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful, but...
And I assume people can find it on Facebook and social. Is it on Facebook?
Yeah, I do have Facebook.
I'm sure I've seen it on Facebook.
I do have Facebook. I grimace because I don't really know what I'm doing with social media. But,
at the end of the day, Google is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
You put it into Google, hopefully we'll find it.
Yeah.
Cool, awesome. Leah, it's been absolutely awesome chatting.
Thank you for the opportunity.
No worries. Any last words? We've covered so much. I don't know if we'll end up on another whole conversation, but...
I could end with a poem by a woman in prison that really, I think, sums up everything that
I've
said.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds good.
So shall I do it to you rather than to the camera?
I don't know. What does it make a difference to you? I don't know. It's quite nice to do it to the camera, but if you're happy to.
Okay. All right, then.
Yeah.
I'll try to the camera. So this is a poem by a woman called V, and it was in a women's prison, and she gave me this poem, and I think it sums up everything I've said. Know me. Tell me that you know me. As you look into my eyes, I hope you realize that you know me. If I drift so far out, if I don't wave or shout, will you jump in to save me? Or will you let me go because you didn't know? Just one look from you to show that I've got through could be enough to save me.
Awesome. That was amazing. Leah, thank you so much indeed. And it's been absolutely wonderful. I'm going to call it, otherwise I'm going to keep asking you more questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
An absolutely massive thank you to the very inspirational Leah Thorn. That was, as you can probably tell from my questions, I had multiple questions that I couldn't get out in a coherent fashion because there were just so many of them. So absolutely wonderful to listen to her stories and really inspiring. And I hope that even in the short term has given you guys out there listening a little bit of inspiration to maybe share your thoughts, that to take on being vulnerable, maybe try some poetry. As she said, it's not something that has to be word perfect, just give it a try and see what happens and see how you feel in response to doing it. It just sounds wonderful, and I'm gonna stop there because otherwise I could clearly waffle on. But so massive thank you to Leah, and a huge thank you to you guys for watching out there, and a big thank you to our sponsors. We couldn't do it without them. We couldn't bring you these videos. So they are QBH Solutions, HR and compliance support, local firm based right here in Folkestone, serving small and medium businesses in the southeast, and they are all about making those stressful compliance issues, GDH, GDPR, I hope I've got that the right way around, easy to understand and taking the stress away. And we also have Bullfish Glass Services. These guys are bespoke glass manufacturers, again based right here in Folkestone, so a great local firm that can really help you bring your design idea to life, be that any kind of interior design, bespoke glass fitting, colours, the whole lot. It's awesome stuff. So big thank you to them, big thank you to Leah, and big thank you to you guys listening out there. I'll see you next week. Bye.